My name is Maya Henderson. I am 8 years old, though I've been told I have the eyes of someone much older, especially after what happened on July 14, 2025. We live in a small pocket of rural Pennsylvania, specifically a town called Oley, where the dirt is rich and the humidity hangs over the kale rows like a wet blanket. That morning started like any other harvest day on our family's organic farm. The sun was already biting at my neck by 9:00 a.m., and my parents were a few rows behind me, their voices muffled by the rustling of the leaves. I remember the smell of damp earth and the specific, sharp scent of bruised greens as I filled my wooden crate. I was wearing my favorite yellow long-sleeve shirt and my straw hat, the one with the frayed edges that always tickled my forehead. In the footage you see of that morning, I look perfectly healthy. I'm smiling, holding a crate of fresh kale, feeling the rough wood against my palms. But inside, something was beginning to fray. It started as a dull throb behind my eyes, a rhythmic pulsing that synchronized with the cicadas screaming in the trees. I didn't say anything because, in a farming family, you don't complain about a headache when there's a crop to get in before the rain. I remember looking back at my mom and dad, they looked so happy, framed by the endless green of the valley. Then, the world tilted. It wasn't a dizzy spell. It was as if the gravity of the earth suddenly doubled. The wooden crate felt like it weighed 100 pounds. My knees hit the dirt first, a soft, muted thud. I tried to call out, but my tongue felt like a piece of dry leather in my mouth. I saw my dad drop his basket and start running, his boots kicking up dust, but he looked like he was moving through corn syrup. The last thing I felt was the cool, damp leaves of the kale against my cheek as I collapsed into the row. There was no pain, just a sudden, terrifying silence that swallowed the sound of the tractor in the distance. My heart, which had been racing, gave one final, stuttering kick and then simply stopped. The transition from the warmth of the sun-drenched field to the sterile, freezing air of the emergency room at Reading Hospital was instantaneous and jarring. I wasn't in my body anymore. I was hovering near the acoustic ceiling tiles, looking down at a frantic choreography of blue scrubs and white coats. I saw myself, or rather, the shell of me. My yellow shirt had been cut down the middle, ruined. My straw hat was on a plastic chair in the corner, looking incredibly out of place. A nurse was kneeling on the bed, her arms locked straight as she delivered chest compressions. I could hear the rhythmic, sickening crunch of my ribs, a sound I felt in my soul even if my physical ears weren't working. The lead doctor, a man named Dr. Eris with graying hair and a voice that was too calm for the situation, was calling out numbers. APN. Charge to 100. Clear. My body jolted, my legs kicking out like a landed fish. It looked violent. It looked like they were fighting a war over a piece of meat. I wanted to tell them to stop, not because I wanted to die, but because it looked so exhausting for them. I looked over at the doorway and saw my mother. She wasn't screaming. She was standing perfectly still, her hands pressed against her mouth so hard her fingernails were white. She was staring at my feet, my dirty, bare feet peeking out from under the thin hospital sheet. I felt a strange sense of detachment. I noticed the clock on the wall, it was 10:42 a.m. I noticed a discarded gum wrapper on the floor near the trash can. The medical realism of the room was suffocating. The flatline isn't a long, dramatic beep like in the movies, it's a series of urgent, percussive alarms that set your teeth on edge. Still no rhythm, Dr. Eris said, his brow furrowed with a frustration that went beyond professional concern. He looked at the clock, then back at me. I realized then that I was dead. Not fainting, dead, but clinically, biologically gone. The light in the room began to change, not into a tunnel, but the walls themselves seemed to dissolve, replacing the smell of antiseptic with something that felt like home, yet carried a weight of a warning that would soon tear my world apart. The hospital walls didn't just vanish, they became translucent, like layers of thin tracing paper being peeled away by an invisible hand. I found myself standing in a long, corridor-like space that felt familiar but impossible. It wasn't the hospital hallway anymore. The linoleum was gone, replaced by a surface that felt like polished glass but moved like water under my bare feet. And then, he was there. He wasn't glowing with a blinding, cinematic light that obscured his features. He looked real. He looked tired in a way that felt deeply human, yet his eyes held a stillness that made the frantic energy of the ER feel like a distant, flickering candle. He wore a simple, dark tunic, and his hands, the ones the Sunday school books always showed as perfectly clean, were calloused and stained with what looked like garden soil. "Maya," he said. His voice didn't echo. It was a direct, internal resonance, like the sound of my own heart finally finding its rhythm. He didn't offer a hug or a grand gesture. He simply pointed back toward the world I had just left. Through the shimmering walls, I could see my church back in Oley. It was Sunday morning in this vision, a few weeks into the future. I saw Pastor Miller standing at the pulpit, his face red, his veins bulging as he shouted about prosperity and the vessels of wrath outside our doors. I saw the congregation nodding, their faces tight with a strange kind of hunger, not for God, but for a reason to stay angry. Jesus looked at me, and his expression wasn't one of anger, but of a profound, shattering grief. "They have built fences where I laid down roads," he told me. His voice was heavy, like a man describing a house he had built with his own hands being systematically dismantled by the people living inside it. He told me that the division wasn't coming from the world, it was being manufactured in the very places meant to offer peace. He explained that a great sifting was beginning, and that my return would be the catalyst for a fracture in my own community. He spoke of 2026 as a year where the temples of stone would start to crack from the inside because they had traded the bread of life for the stones of judgment. I felt a cold shiver go through my spirit. I wasn't being sent back to tell a happy story about clouds and harps. I was being sent back with a weight that felt heavier than the crate of kale I had dropped in the field. As I stood there, the scene shifted. I wasn't looking at the church anymore. I was looking at my own dinner table. It was autumn, the leaves outside our window a fiery, dying red. My father was sitting across from my Uncle David, a man I had always loved, a man who gave me peppermint candies after service every week. But in this vision, their faces were distorted by a mask of cold, hard certainty. There was a Bible open between them, but they weren't reading it together. They were using it like a weapon, pointing at verses and then at each other. The air in our kitchen, which usually smelled of cinnamon and wood smoke, felt charged with a static electricity that made my skin crawl. "The message I give you will not bring them together, Maya," Jesus said, standing beside me in that quiet, watery space. "It will act as a mirror. Some will look into it and see their own need for mercy. Others will look into it, see their own pride, and try to break the mirror." He told me specifically that when I spoke of what I saw, of the fact that he was grieved by the walls they were building against their neighbors, the elders would call me deceived. He said my own father would struggle to look me in the eye because my words would challenge the safety of the anger he had cultivated. The personal cost began to settle on me. I saw a vision of my locker at school, scrawled with a word I didn't quite understand but felt the sting of. I saw my mother crying in the pantry, hiding her face so I wouldn't see the toll that a miracle was taking on our family's reputation in the valley. Jesus touched my shoulder, and for a moment, the weight vanished, replaced by a clarity that was almost more painful. They will ask for a sign, he whispered, and the sign will be the hardening of their own hearts. He explained that the message that divides was simply the truth that God does not belong to a building or a border. This was the warning, that the institution of the church was becoming a tomb for the Spirit, and that my life would become the evidence they couldn't ignore. I looked down at my hands and saw they were no longer translucent. I could feel the coldness of the hospital room beginning to seep back in, the smell of ozone and burnt hair from the defibrillator paddles. The transition was starting, and the peace was being replaced by the terrifying responsibility of the breath I was about to take. The transition back wasn't a gentle slide, it was a violent collision. One moment I was standing in that watery, silent space with Jesus, and the next, my chest exploded with a searing, white-hot agony. I felt the electric jolt of the defibrillator paddles arc through my skin, smelling like singed hair and ozone. My eyes snapped open to the harsh, fluorescent glare of the ER. Dr. Aris was leaning over me, his mask pulled down, his face a mask of pure shock. "We have a pulse," someone shouted. I couldn't speak. My throat felt like it was filled with broken glass, and all I could do was stare at the ceiling tiles, seeing the faint, shimmering outlines of the truth I had just been shown overlapping the sterile reality of the hospital. 3 weeks later, I was back at Grace Bible Fellowship in Oley. The transition from miracle child to problem happened faster than the seasons changed. I remember sitting in the third row, the sun streaming through the stained glass, casting long, bloody red shadows across the pews. My father sat next to me, his hand resting heavily on his shoulder, his chest puffed out with a pride that made me feel sick. He thought my return was a trophy for his faith. But when Pastor Miller called me up to the pulpit to share the vision of glory, the air in the sanctuary changed. I didn't talk about golden streets. I stood on a small wooden step stool so I could reach the microphone and told them about the soil on Jesus' hands. I told them his heart was breaking because they had turned the church into a fortress of anger rather than a house of bread. The silence that followed was heavy, like the air before a tornado. I saw Mrs. Gable, who had taught me Sunday school since I was 3, pull her hand away from the pew as if it were hot. I watched the elders exchange looks. Tight, clipped nods that signaled a closing of ranks. I told them what Jesus said about the temples of stone cracking in 2026. I saw my father's hand drop from my shoulder. He didn't look at me. He looked at the floor, his jaw tight. The social tension wasn't a loud argument, it was the sudden, collective indrawing of breath and the way the room suddenly felt 20 degrees colder. I wasn't their miracle anymore. I was a mirror, and they didn't like what was looking back at them. The personal fracture Jesus warned me about arrived on a Tuesday night in late August. We were having dinner, pot roast and carrots from the garden, but the clinking of silverware against ceramic sounded like hammers on stone. My Uncle David was there, his Bible sitting on the corner of the table like an uninvited guest. He had been one of the loudest voices calling for an investigation into my testimony at the church board meeting the night before. He looked at me, his eyes narrowed, searching my 8-year-old face for a sign of the enemy. Maya, he said, his voice dropping into that low, performative register he used for prayer. We just want to make sure you aren't being confused. The Lord doesn't speak against his own church. He doesn't side with the world. I looked at him, and for a second, I saw the vision again, the way his face had distorted in the watery light. I realized then that my relationship with my favorite uncle was over. It wasn't a gradual drifting, it was a clean, jagged break. He wasn't seeing his niece, he was seeing a threat to his worldview. My mother tried to intervene, her voice trembling as she asked for more gravy, but the tension was an invisible wall cutting the table in half. My father finally spoke, and his words were the ones that hurt the most. Maybe we should stop talking about the division for a while, Maya. People are starting to whisper. They're saying we didn't raise you right. He said it with a flat, exhausted tone that felt like a betrayal. He was choosing the comfort of his social standing over the truth of what I had experienced. I felt a cold, hollow space open up in my chest, right where the defibrillator had burned me. I realized that the warning wasn't just for the church as a building, it was for my own home. I was losing my family's protection because I wouldn't tell the lie they wanted to hear. I pushed my plate away, the roast beef suddenly tasting like ash, and walked out to the porch, listening to the cicadas and knowing that the sifting Jesus spoke of had already begun in my own kitchen. The transition from the kitchen table to the church boardroom felt like a slow-motion car crash. It was late September, and the air in Oley had turned crisp, but inside the windowless basement of Grace Bible Fellowship, the humidity was stifling. I was sitting on a folding metal chair that felt ice-cold against my legs. Across from me sat the 5 elders and Pastor Miller. They didn't look like the men who had brought my family casseroles after my collapse. They looked like a jury. My father sat behind me, his breath hitching every time I spoke, a silent plea for me to recant. Maya, Pastor Miller began, leaning forward until the fluorescent light caught the sweat on his forehead. You keep saying Jesus is grieved by our stance. You're saying he's unhappy with how we protect the flock from the world. Do you understand that you're accusing godly men of sin? I looked at his hands, manicured, soft, clutching a leather-bound Bible like a shield. I remembered the soil on Jesus's fingernails. I remembered the grief in his eyes. The direct explanation Jesus gave me in that watery space suddenly flooded back into my mind, as clear as a high-definition recording. He told me why 2026 will be the year the walls fall, I said, my voice steady in a way that scared me. He said you've spent so much time defining who is out that you've forgotten how to be in him. He said the church is dividing because you've made an idol out of your own certainty. The room went deathly quiet. I saw Elder Higgins's face turn a mottled purple. This was the moment Jesus warned me about, the message that divides. I wasn't giving them a metaphor, I was telling them that their institutional pride was the very thing rotting the foundation. I explained that the sifting wasn't a punishment from the outside, but a natural consequence of choosing power over presence. They wanted a prophecy about politics or the economy. I gave them a mirror of their own hardened hearts. The personal choice Jesus presented to me wasn't about whether I would live or die, that had already been decided in the ER. The choice was whether I would carry the weight of the truth or trade it for my family's peace. After the boardroom meeting, the personal future threat became a reality. My father was asked to step down from his position as a deacon. The miracle girl was now being whispered about as a vessel of confusion. I saw my mother standing in the grocery store aisle, her hand frozen on a box of cereal as a former friend turned her cart around to avoid speaking to her. One night, I found my father in the barn, sitting on a hay bale with his head in his hands. The moral compromise was laid out before me. He looked up, his eyes red-rimmed. "Maya, if you just say you were confused, if you just say the medication made you see things, we can have our lives back. We can go back to how it was." This was the sifting. This was the fracture. I had to choose between the man who raised me and the man who brought me back from the dead. I felt a physical ache in my chest, a phantom pull at my ribs where they had been cracked during CPR. "I can't lie, Dad," I whispered. "If I lie, the version of you I'm saving isn't the real you anyway." He didn't yell. He didn't even argue. He just looked through me, as if I had already disappeared. That was the uncomfortable human moment that broke me more than the clinical death ever could. I realized that by following the message, I was becoming an outsider in my own home. The institutional loss was complete. We were officially asked to stop attending Grace Bible. My parents' social circle, built over 20 years, vanished in a single weekend. We were alone in the valley, the harvest rotting in the fields because no one would come to help us pick it anymore. The warning wasn't just words, it was the sound of our front door locking against a world that used to be ours. The direct dialogue from Jesus in that watery, shifting space wasn't a suggestion, it was a blueprint for the fracture I was now living through. As I sat in my bedroom in Oley, watching the dust motes dance in the autumn light, his words played back with terrifying clarity. He had stood there, his hand resting on a shimmering partition that showed the year 2026. "Maya," he had said, "the title of this message is The Division of the Houses. The churches will divide because they have confused the boundary of their building with the boundary of my kingdom." He explained that the outcome of this sifting is determined by one thing, the willingness to lose power to gain mercy. He told me that 2026 would be different because the invisible middle ground was dissolving. "The ones who use my name to build walls against the broken will find those walls turning into the walls of a prison," he said. He was specific. He told me that the division wouldn't just be between different denominations, but within families sitting at the same pew. "The pride of certainty is the great divider," he explained. "They think they are defending me, but they are only defending their own comfort." This was why the message divided. It forced a choice between the institutional safety of a correct theology and the raw, uncomfortable requirement of sacrificial love. He told me the outcome for each person would be determined by their reaction to the least of these in their own neighborhoods. The return to the body had been the easy part compared to the real-world confirmation that began to manifest that winter. It started with a series of text messages my mother received. Blue bubbles of cold rejection from women she had known for decades. One read, "We're praying for Maya's deliverance from these delusions. Until then, it's best we don't carpool." The social withdrawal was surgical. But the true confirmation came through a specific detail Jesus had shown me, a silent ledger. He told me that the very men who claimed to be protecting the church's sanctity were quietly diverting funds to legal battles to keep outsiders away from the local community center. I remember walking past the church basement door one evening after a school event, the only place I was still allowed to go, and hearing Pastor Miller's voice. He wasn't praying. He was discussing litigation strategies and zoning restrictions to block a refugee housing project 3 towns over. This was the temple of stone, cracking from the inside. Jesus had told me they will use the law to replace the Spirit. Seeing it happen, hearing the same voice that preached on Sunday talking about property values, and undesirables on a Tuesday was like watching a prophecy breathe. The personal future threat Jesus whispered about wasn't a monster under the bed, it was the realization that the people I had been taught to trust were the ones the warning was directed at. My stomach twisted with a physical nausea that no hospital medicine could touch. By the spring of 2026, the air in Oley felt different, thinner, more electric, as if a storm that had been brewing for years was finally touching down. Jesus had told me that a sign would come, something subtle but undeniable that would prove the warning wasn't a product of my oxygen-deprived brain. It happened on a Tuesday morning at the local Farmers Bank and Trust. I was waiting with my mom as she tried to navigate our dwindling farm accounts. The bank manager, a man who had served as a deacon alongside my father for 10 years, wouldn't look us in the eye. He kept his gaze fixed on his computer monitor, his fingers tapping a rhythmic, nervous beat against the desk. "I'm sorry, Sarah," he said, his voice flat and devoid of the warmth it usually held. "The line of credit for the spring planting has been restructured. The board feels the farm is no longer a sound investment given the instability of the situation." This was the irreversible grounded event. It wasn't just a loss of money, it was the institutional machinery of our own community turning its gears to grind us down. As we walked out, I saw a notification on a digital kiosk in the lobby, a news alert about a massive schism in the National Church Council over the very issues of boundary and mercy Jesus had described. My heart hammered against my ribs. The sifting wasn't just happening to us, it was a tectonic shift. I looked at my mom's trembling hands and knew our life on the farm, as we knew it, was over. This was the proof. The world hadn't ended in fire, but our place in it had vanished in a series of digital keystrokes and avoided glances. We drove home in a silence so heavy it felt like the car was underwater. The lush green rose of the valley, which used to feel like a sanctuary, now felt like a foreign country. My father was waiting for us on the porch, his shadow long and thin against the white siding of the farmhouse. He didn't ask how the bank meeting went, he already knew. He was holding a small, weathered wooden sign, the one that used to hang at the end of our driveway that read, "Henderson Family Farms, all are welcome." He was turning it over and over in his hands, staring at the chipped paint. The message that divides had done its work. Our church was split, our family was fractured, and our livelihood was gone. I walked up the steps and stood beside him. He didn't pull away this time, but he didn't reach out either. We just stood there, two people caught in the middle of a collapsing world. The sun began to set, casting a deep, bruised purple over the kale fields I had collapsed in nearly a year ago. I looked down at the porch floorboards and saw a single, small green sprout pushing up through a crack in the wood. A tiny, stubborn piece of life thriving in a place where it shouldn't be. It was fragile, easily crushed, and completely indifferent to the storm. I watched it sway in the evening breeze, the tension of the warning still humming in my marrow, a mixture of cold fear and a strange, quiet hope that I was finally seeing things exactly as they were.
If this message felt important, it probably was. There are more stories like this, and they only get deeper. Subscribe now so you don't miss the next one, because some warnings aren't meant to be ignored.